A man can spend his whole life keeping order, but it only takes one lie to turn his world upside down. My name's Eric Callahan. I'm 68 years old, and I've been the sheriff of Willow Creek for over 3 decades. This town raised me, and I swore a long time ago that I'd keep it safe. I know every street, every name, every damn thing that happens here. Justice ain't a word to me. It's a way of life. People count on me, and I've never let him down. But when it came to my own home, I'd been blind. It started with a damn receipt. I was sitting at the kitchen table, balancing the household books like I always did at the end of the month. The numbers had to match, the bills had to be paid, and every dollar had to be accounted for. That's how you keep order, by keeping things in line. But as I went through the credit card statements, something didn't sit right. A charge from the Peabody Hotel in Memphis. Room service. Spa treatment. A stay for 2. Camille had been in Memphis 2 weekends ago. Some business conference, she said. I didn't question it at the time. Should've. I sat there staring at the paper, jaw clenched. A man don't need much to put 2 and 2 together. Could have called her in, slammed the receipt down, demanded the truth. But I wasn't some hot-headed kid anymore. No, this needed patience. Control. I took a deep breath, folded the receipt, and slid it into my pocket. That night, I watched her closer. Camille had always been sharp, a woman who could command a boardroom just as easily as she managed a dinner party. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and leaned against the counter like nothing was wrong. "You're quiet tonight," she said, taking a sip. "Long day," I muttered, watching her. She nodded like that was enough of an answer and went back to scrolling through her phone. I could feel the distance between us like a canyon. It hadn't always been that way, but I'd been a fool to think things were fine. Over the next week, I paid attention. Not just to her, but to everything. People talk in small towns, and even when they don't mean to, they leave breadcrumbs. I stopped by Joe's bar one evening. Nothing unusual there. The place was half full, the jukebox playing some old George Strait song, the smell of spilled beer and fried food hanging in the air. Jack, the bartender, barely looked up as he wiped down the counter. "Whiskey, neat?" I said, settling onto the stool. Jack poured without a word, too busy half listening to a couple at the end of the bar. I followed his line of sight, and that's when I saw her. Camille, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize at first. Mid-50s, clean-shaven, wearing a damn tracksuit. Looked like he'd just walked out of a damn yoga class. He leaned in, talking low, and she laughed. One of those soft laughs women only give when they're real comfortable with someone. I didn't need to hear what they were saying. I knew. Jack set my drink down. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" I shook my head. "Nope." Took a sip and let the burn settle. Jack shrugged, moving down the bar, uninterested. I sat there, watching. The man, Samuel Hayes, reached across the table, brushed his fingers over Camille's wrist. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in a little closer. I finished my drink, left a tip, and walked out without a word. That drive home was slow, controlled. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, my breathing even. But inside, I was steel tightening, ready to break. 30 years in law enforcement had taught me patience. A case wasn't solved in a single night. You built it, piece by piece, until you had something solid enough to stand on. That's exactly what I was going to do. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light. I sat in the truck a minute, gripping the wheel, staring at the front door. Everything looked the same. The neat flower beds Camille had planted last spring, the rocking chairs on the porch that hardly ever got used, the windows reflecting back the life I thought I knew. But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. Inside, the clock on the wall read just past 10. I moved through the house quiet, listening. Upstairs, the faint sound of running water. Camille was showering. I set my keys down, poured myself a drink, and leaned against the kitchen counter. A man's house ought to feel like his sanctuary. That night, it felt like enemy territory. I took my time finishing that whiskey, then made my way upstairs. Camille was in bed, lamp on, flipping through a magazine like she didn't have a care in the world. She glanced up when I stepped in. "You were out late," she said, casual. "Yeah." I sat on the edge of the bed, pulling off my boots. "Had a drink at Joe's." She barely reacted. How was that?" "Quiet," I said, watching her. "Saw you there." That got her attention. Just a flicker, but I caught it. The pause, the quick calculation behind her eyes before she masked it with a small, easy smile. "Oh, I was just catching up with an old friend." That right? She nodded, holding my gaze like she wasn't hiding a damn thing. Yeah, Sam and I go way back. He's been helping me with some back issues, physical therapy, and all that. Physical therapy, I echoed, rolling my shoulders. Might have to stop by his office myself, see what he can do for these old bones. Camille gave a short, breathy laugh and went back to her magazine. He's good at what he does. I bet he is. I let the conversation die there, didn't press it. No need. She thought she had me fooled, and that was fine, for now. I turned off the light, laid down, and listened to her breathe. Steady, unbothered. Meanwhile, my mind was running a mile a minute, lining up my next steps. The next morning, I got up before she did, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, and started making notes. Facts. Movements. A pattern would show itself if I paid close enough attention. Camille was careful, but not careful enough. I already knew she was seeing him in Memphis. Now I needed to know how often, who else knew, and just how deep this thing ran. I started small. Went about my day like nothing had changed. At the station, I handled the usual. Drunks sobering up in the tank, a few minor disputes, nothing serious. But between calls, I made time to dig. First stop, the courthouse. I had an old buddy there, Randy, who worked records. Stopped by under the guise of catching up, shot the breeze for a while before steering the conversation where I needed it to go. Hey, Randy, I said, setting my coffee down on his desk. You ever hear the name Dr. Samuel Hayes come through here? Runs a PT clinic over on Mason Street. Randy frowned, rubbing his jaw. Hayes? Yeah, that rings a bell. Think he did some work with the high school football team a while back. Why? He in some kind of trouble? Not yet, I said, keeping it light. Just curious. Randy nodded, tapping on his keyboard. Let me check something real quick. He clicked through a few files, then let out a low whistle. Well, looks like your boy's got some financial disputes. Small claims, mostly. Couple of unpaid invoices from vendors. Nothing criminal, but it ain't exactly clean either. Interesting. A man who was bad with money usually had other weaknesses. I filed that away and kept moving. Stopped by a diner for lunch. Made conversation with folks. Listened. People never think twice about talking around me. I'm just the sheriff. Just OL Eric. Been here forever, always will be. They forget I listen more than I talk. That's how you catch things. By the end of the week, I had what I needed. Camille had been seeing Hayes for months. It wasn't just Memphis. She was meeting him in town too. A couple of quiet dinners at out-of-the-way places, a weekend where she'd told me she was visiting a friend in Nashville, but had actually been in a cabin up near Lake Burton. I sat on that information, let it settle. Confronting her wouldn't do a damn thing except give her the chance to lie to my face. No, I needed to hit her where it hurt. Camille prided herself on control, on her polished image, on always being one step ahead. The best way to break her? Take that away. And as for Hayes, he was just a man who didn't know he'd stepped into the wrong fight. But he'd learn. Saturday morning, I woke up before the sun, like always. Habit. Years of early shifts, late nights, and never truly sleeping with both eyes closed had wired me that way. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, looking out at the yard, watching the sky turn from black to deep blue. The world was quiet, peaceful, but my mind wasn't. I'd always believed a man's greatest weapon wasn't his fists or his gun, but his patience. People get sloppy when they think they've won. And right now, Camille and Hayes thought they had me beat. Camille came downstairs a little after 7, still in her silk robe, hair damp from the shower. She barely looked at me as she poured her coffee, already scrolling through her phone. That told me plenty. When a woman's lying, she either overcompensates or she avoids. Camille was in avoidance mode. You working today? She asked, still not looking up. I took a sip of coffee. Nah, got some things to take care of around town. She nodded, flipping to the next email, already lost in whatever world she lived in now. I've got a client lunch in Nashville. Won't be back till late. That's so. Yeah. She finally glanced at me, all casual. I'll probably just grab a hotel since it'll run late. She wanted to see if I'd react, if I'd ask questions. I just nodded. Makes sense. That seemed to satisfy her. She kissed me on the cheek, habit, not affection, and went upstairs to get ready. I listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing, the clink of jewelry, the rustle of clothes. A woman like Camille didn't just cheat. She planned, calculated. She'd built her whole life that way. Everything precise, polished, controlled. I was about to take all that away from her. I let her go without another word. She drove off in her Lexus, looking as put together as ever. But she wouldn't be going to Nashville. Not unless Hayes had moved the damn city overnight. I knew exactly where she'd be. Instead of following her, I went to the gym. Needed to work off some of the slow-burning anger in my gut. I wasn't stupid. Rage didn't win fights. Strategy did. And the best way to stay sharp was to stay moving. Mike Bear, Dalton was already there, sweat dripping off him, deadlifting like it was personal. He saw me walk in, nodded, and racked the bar. Well, hell, look who finally decided to act his age and take care of himself. Go to hell, I muttered, setting down my bag. You still owe me 50 from that poker game. Bear grinned, wiping his face with a towel. You're never getting that money, old man. I started warming up, joints stiff but still working. Bear leaned against the rack, watching me. So, he said, like he'd been waiting to bring it up. You ready to talk about why you look like you want to put a hole in someone's head? Just life, I said, rolling my shoulders. And life's name is. I glanced at him. Bear wasn't the kind of man you lied to not because he'd judge you, but because he'd see right through it. He'd been through hell himself, crawled out the other side, and made peace with his demons. Now he spent his time making sure others did the same. Camille, I said finally. He let out a slow breath. Shit. That bad. I nodded. You confront her yet? Not yet. Bear studied me. You waiting for something specific or just enjoying the slow burn? Timing, I said. She's careful. I need her off balance before I make my move. He grunted in approval. Smart. You know I'm here if you need anything. I did. And it meant something. But this was mine to handle. After an hour of pushing myself harder than usual, I hit the showers, changed, and left the gym feeling clear-headed. There was work to do. By mid-afternoon, I was parked a few blocks from the Willow Creek Inn. Small, upscale, just outside of town, discreet enough for people who didn't want to be seen. Camille's car was in the lot. So was Hayes's. I didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, I took out my phone and started typing. Unknown number. Heard your girl's been seeing someone else too. Thought you should know. I hit send and watched. 5 minutes later, Hayes walked out of the hotel lobby, phone in hand, looking around like a man expecting to get jumped. Good. He was nervous now. He'd start asking questions, doubting things. Camille would have to do damage control, juggle her lies. Cracks would form. I just needed to widen them. I waited another hour before driving off. The real move was coming. But for now, I was happy to let them squirm. Sunday morning rolled in slow, the way it always did. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the town wake up. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that told you fall was settling in for good. Across the street, old man Ridley was already out sweeping his driveway, like the leaves had personally wronged him. The world kept turning, same as ever, but my mind was miles away. I'd left them to stew overnight. Camille got home late, just like she said she would, slipping into bed without a word. But there was tension in the way she moved, that little stiffness in her shoulders. Something had rattled her. Probably Hayes getting paranoid. Good. I let her sleep, and while I took my time with breakfast. Bacon, eggs, toast. The kind of morning that felt normal, steady. But under the surface, I was lining up my next shot. By the time she came downstairs, dressed like she'd planned to go to church but changed her mind last minute, I had the paper open in front of me, barely looking up. She poured her coffee, lingered by the counter. You got plans today? She asked, voice even. Thinking about heading down to the station for a bit. Then maybe lunch at the diner. She nodded, like she was filing that information away. I might run some errands, maybe stop by the office. That right? A pause. Yeah, just a few things I need to catch up on. I looked up then, real slow, just enough to meet her eyes. You and Hayes working today? There. That flicker. The slight tightening around her mouth before she smoothed it over. What? You heard me. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. I don't know what you think is going on, but you need to drop it, Eric. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. Funny thing. I don't recall bringing up anything going on. Camille's jaw tensed. I don't have time for this. Course you don't, I said, standing up, grabbing my hat. Busy woman like you, always running off somewhere. I walked past her, not giving her the satisfaction of a real fight. That would come later. At the station, I handled business as usual. Signed off on reports, checked in with the deputies. But in between all that, I was on my phone, making moves. I had a contact in Memphis, a guy who owed me a favor. Used to be a PI, now ran a security firm. Need you to pull a few things for me. I told him when he picked up. Yeah? What kind of things? Hotel security footage. The Peabody, a few weekends back. He let out a low whistle. Big game hunting today, huh? Just tying up some loose ends. Gotcha. Give me a few hours. I hung up, went about my day. Late afternoon, my phone buzzed. One new message. A still shot from the hotel cameras. Camille. Hayes. Checking in together. Cold. Hard proof. I stared at it for a long moment, then slipped the phone back in my pocket. I could end it right now. Drop the picture in front of her, watch her try to spin a lie around it. But that would be too easy. No, this needed to play out the right way. That evening, I sent another text. Unknown number. Seems like your girl's got more secrets than you thought. Maybe you should start asking questions. Then I waited. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, I saw Hayes's car pull up outside Camille's office. I parked a block away, just close enough to watch. He got out, moving fast, the kind of speed that said he wasn't there for a friendly chat. I rolled down my window, listening. You've been lying to me. Hayes's voice, sharp, carrying through the quiet street. Camille stepped outside, arms crossed, looking every bit like the woman who always thought she had control. Lower your voice. You said I was the only one, that it was different with me. You need to leave. Right now. Who else? He took a step closer. Who the hell else have you been playing? She didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Hayes ran a hand through his hair, looking like a man who just realized he'd bet everything on a losing horse. Unbelievable. I put my neck on the line for you. I ruined my reputation. Camille's voice cut through like a blade. You ruined your reputation all on your own. Cold. No regret. No guilt. Just business as usual for her. Hayes stood there a second, like he didn't know whether to yell or just walk away. Then he did the smart thing. Got in his car and peeled off down the road. I let out a breath, watching the way Camille stood there, straightening her blouse like none of it mattered. She thought she'd won. She always did. But she wasn't the only one pulling strings. Tomorrow, she'd find out just how much she'd lost. The next morning, I was up early, sipping coffee on the porch while the town stretched and yawned its way awake. The newspaper sat on the table beside me, but I wasn't reading it. My mind was already on the next move. Camille came downstairs about an hour later, dressed sharp as always, heels clicking against the wood floor. She barely looked at me as she grabbed her usual black coffee and checked her phone, probably waiting for a message that wasn't coming. I let the silence stretch between us. Finally, she glanced up. Something wrong. I sipped my coffee. Nope. She studied me for half a second, like she was trying to get a read on my mood, but I didn't give her anything. Instead, I leaned back, real easy. How was work yesterday? I asked, voice casual. Fine, she said, just as smooth. No surprises? She hesitated. Just a beat, but I caught it. No. What? I shook my head. No reason. I watched her, the way she kept her movements precise, controlled. But I could see it now, the edges fraying just a little. She was thinking about Hayes. About their little argument in the parking lot. About whether or not I knew anything. She was measuring the risk, the way she always did. You heading out? I asked. She nodded. Meetings in town. Good luck with that. I drained the rest of my coffee and stood, stretching. Guess I should head out too. Big day ahead. She frowned slightly, like she wanted to ask what I meant, but she bit it back. I grabbed my hat and keys, stepped past her, and let her wonder. By the time I pulled into the station, my phone was already buzzing. Text from my buddy in Memphis. Video's ready. Sent the file. Hope she's worth the trouble. I tapped the link and let it load. The security footage from the Peabody. Camille and Hayes, clear as day, walking in together, checking in, laughing, talking close, disappearing down the hallway toward their room. Hard proof. No spin. No way out. I forwarded the file. One to my lawyer. One to the mayor's office. One to the board of directors at Camille's firm. No message, no explanation. Just the facts. Let the evidence do the talking. Then I sent one last message. Unknown number. Thought you should see this before you hear it from someone else. Hayes. I set my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and waited. Didn't take long. 30 minutes later, my office door slammed open. Deputy Carter, young kid, barely out of the academy, jumped in his seat. What the hell, Sheriff? I barely looked up. Mornin', Sam. Hayes stood there, breathing heavy, face red. He had the look of a man whose whole world had just caved in on itself. You set me up, he spat. I folded my hands on the desk. I don't recall making you cheat with a married woman, but sure. Let's go with that. His fists clenched. You don't get it. She lied to me, Eric. She said. I raised a hand. Don't care what she said. Don't care what you thought this was. All I know is, you stepped where you shouldn't have, and now you're paying for it. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. Jesus. My career's shot. You know what happens when this gets out? I shrugged. Not my problem. He stopped, glaring at me. What do you want, huh? You want to gloat? You want me to apologize? I stood, slow and steady, letting him feel the weight of the room shift. What I want, Sam, is for you to disappear. You don't work here anymore. You don't live here anymore. You pack your things, you find another town, and you don't ever come back. His jaw tightened. You can't make me leave. I stepped around the desk, closing the distance between us. You're right, I said, voice low. But this town sure as hell can. He swallowed, the fight draining out of him. He knew it. I knew it. Willow Creek wasn't big, and word traveled fast. By the end of the day, he'd be a pariah. No clients, no reputation, no reason to stay. After a long moment, he nodded, shoulders sagging. Yeah, all right. Smart choice. He turned, yanking the door open, then stopped. She's gonna come after you, you know. I smiled. Let her. He left without another word. By the time I checked my phone again, the fallout had begun. My lawyer had already responded, moving forward with the divorce. The mayor had seen the video, and I knew what that meant. Camille's days at her firm were numbered. She'd built her career on appearances, on playing the perfect executive. But no one trusts a woman who can't keep her own house in order. I walked out of my office, nodded at Carter. I'll be out for a bit. He nodded, still looking rattled from Hayes' little scene. I drove through town, slow and steady. Stopped by the diner, grabbed a coffee to go. People were already whispering. That was the thing about justice. It didn't always come with a bang. Sometimes, it came like a slow, creeping tide, washing away everything that wasn't strong enough to stand. Camille thought she was untouchable. Thought she could play her game and walk away clean. She was about to learn otherwise. By the time I got home, the house felt different. Not quieter. Camille was never one to fill a place with noise, but heavier, like the walls themselves were bracing for the storm. I set my hat on the rack, loosened my belt a notch, and poured a drink. I didn't have to wait long. Camille came through the front door not 10 minutes later, walking like she had somewhere to be. Her heels clicked against the hardwood. Her purse dropped onto the counter with just a little too much force. She was already halfway into her usual routine, slipping out of her blazer, sighing like the weight of the world had been dropped on her shoulders, before she finally turned and looked at me. You did this, she said. I swirled the ice in my glass. Gonna have to be a little more specific. She walked closer, slow and deliberate, like she thought she could still control the temperature in the room. The video. The board meeting. The mayor's office. You really think this is going to go the way you want? I took a sip, let the silence stretch. Already has. She scoffed, shaking her head. God, you're so predictable. You think you're punishing me? You think you're going to ruin me? Her laugh was sharp, humorless. I built this life, Eric. I earned every inch of it. You think some small-town scandal is going to bring me down? I set my glass down, stood up slow. No, Camille. I think you did that all on your own. Her jaw clenched, but I saw it, the flicker of doubt, the calculation behind her eyes shifting. She'd spent her whole life being 3 steps ahead, bending people to her will. But this time, she'd miscalculated. She wasn't dealing with board members or clients who'd been for the right price. She was dealing with a man who'd spent his entire life making sure people answered for their choices. She adjusted her watch, straightened her blouse. I'll fight this. I nodded. Figured you would. She studied me, trying to find some weakness to exploit, some way to turn this back in her favor. You think you can just throw me out? Take the house, the money. She shook her head. You don't have that kind of power. I let out a slow breath, watching her. See, that's the problem, Camille. You still don't get it. I stepped closer, and for the first time, she took a step back. It ain't about power. It's about consequences. And you're finally about to have some. She swallowed, but her face stayed composed. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? I smiled, but there wasn't an ounce of warmth in it. No, ma'am. I'm just a man who finally decided to stop letting a snake live in his house. That landed. She blinked, her fingers tightening against her arms, but she covered it fast. She always did. After a long moment, she sighed, rubbing her temple like I was giving her a headache. Fine. Let's get this over with. I already have. She narrowed her eyes. What? I walked past her, picked up the manila envelope from the kitchen table, and tossed it onto the counter. Divorce papers. Pre-signed. You'll find the terms generous, considering. She didn't pick it up. You're bluffing. Check for yourself. She hesitated, then reached for the envelope, flipping it open. I watched her eyes scan the contents, her face unreadable, her fingers tightening just slightly when she hit the financial breakdown. You really think I'm just going to sign this? She asked, voice quieter now. I leaned against the counter. Doesn't much matter to me. You fight it. You lose more. Your name's already burned. The firm's letting you go quietly, but if you drag this out, they'll make it public. The board's already moving on without you. She stared at the papers a second longer, then shut the folder with a crisp motion. You always needed to win. No, I said, watching her. I just finally learned how to stop losing. We stood there for a moment, the house feeling smaller than it had ever been. Finally, she exhaled, nodding to herself like she was making peace with something. She tucked the folder under her arm and gave me one last, hard look. This town's too small for both of us. I smiled, tilting my head. Then I guess you better start packing. She didn't say another word, just turned and walked out the door. I waited, listening. Heard the car start, the tires crunch over the gravel, the sound fading down the road. When the house was finally quiet again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. And just like that, it was done. 6 months later, I stood in my garage, hands covered in grease, wrench in hand, and a rebuilt '72 Chevelle sitting in front of me like a fresh start. The radio was playing low, some old Johnny Cash tune humming through the air. The place smelled like motor oil, metal, and work. Real, honest work. The house was mine now. Fully mine. Camille had taken her settlement and run off somewhere else, probably to find another place to build her next perfect life. Didn't matter. She wasn't my problem anymore. Hayes? Last I heard, he packed up and left town, just like I told him to. Rumor was, he tried setting up shop in another county, but word followed him like a bad stink. Turns out, people don't trust a man who gets caught in another man's house. Carly had come by a few times since then, more than she had in years. She wasn't a kid anymore, didn't need me to tell her right from wrong, but she'd told me once, over coffee at the diner, that she saw things clearer now. Said she finally understood why I was the way I was. Mom always made it sound like you were the stubborn one, she had said, stirring her coffee, watching me. Turns out, you were just the only one willing to call her bluff. I didn't have an answer for that, so I just nodded. Some things didn't need explaining. Business was steady. The auto shop I'd started after retirement was picking up, mostly word-of-mouth jobs, folks in town bringing in old cars that needed fixing. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My time, my work, my damn rules. After a lifetime of handling other people's messes, it felt good to get my hands on something I could actually put back together. I was underneath the Chevelle, checking the rear suspension, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. A second later, Bear leaned into the garage, arms crossed, that easy grin on his face. Still playing with toys, old man? Still dodging your debts, Dalton? I shot back, sliding out from under the car. He snorted. You ain't ever seeing that $50. I wiped my hands on a rag, nodding toward the workbench. Grab a beer and quit running your mouth. He did, popping the cap off and taking a long drink. Heard about Camille. She's got a place in Atlanta now, from what I hear. I nodded, but I didn't ask for details. What she did, where she went, who she tried to be now, none of it mattered. Bear leaned against the workbench, watching me. You ever think about what's next? I wiped off a wrench, tossing it back in the toolbox. Already here. He laughed, shaking his head. Hell of a thing. You spent your whole life chasing justice, keeping the town in line. Thought you'd have some big plan once it was all said and done. This is the plan. I grabbed my beer, took a slow drink. Wake up, work, go to bed without someone lying next to me pretending they ain't got secrets. He nodded, thoughtful. Not a bad way to live. Nope. The radio crackled, switching to another song, and we stood there for a moment, drinking in the quiet. The shop, the cars, the tools lined up just how I liked them. It was mine. All of it. No lies. No bullshit. Just what I built with my own hands. I never needed to win. I just needed to be free. And I was.